We're lucky today to have with us a very distinguished scholar, a very distinguished military. We have a very distinguished speaker. We have with us General John Allen. John Allen is the president of Brookings Institution. He has been a president since November 2017, and he has been before that a distinguished fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. Good evening, General. How are you?
It's an honor to be with you, Dania. It's good to see you, and it's good to be with you today.
Thank you, General. General Allen is a seasoned military and a seasoned diplomat. He has served several diplomatic roles during his tenure in the military. His long career in the military, he has been he's a retired U.S. Marine Corps. He has been the commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. And he also has been the President Barack Obama presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL. And he also has been a senior advisor for the Secretary of Defense on the Middle East security, in which he handled dialogue for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. General Allen has a long experience in fighting extremism, and he will be telling us all about it. He's a decorated general. He had the Distinguished Honor Award from the State Department and the Distinguished Public Service Award from the National Intelligence. As you know, terrorism is a problem for the region and the world. Today, terrorism is a problem not only for the MENA region, it's everywhere. It's no longer localized. And everywhere of terrorism takes a shorter time to get organized and is more brutal in its approach. The first wave started with Al-Qaeda jihadis from the Arab Gulf. They were from the Gulf. The second wave after the invasion of Iraq was from all over the Arab world. And the third wave after the Syrian crisis is just global. And each one, because of technology, get organized quicker and is, as I said, is even more brutal. So it is becoming an imminent danger as the cost of conducting a terrorist attack are becoming minimal. But on the other hand, terrorism has been an ally to dictatorial regimes that use it as a pretext to crash any dissent. Today, General Allen will discuss with us, we will discuss with him and we will ask him, what are the reasons behind terrorism? Like poverty, sectarianism, maybe injustice and desire for revenge. We will discuss the sessions, in this session, the reasons behind the rise of Salafi jihadism, the reason behind ISIS. How did ISIS rise? What were the context in which we had ISIS, whether it's the Iraq war or the Syrian crisis, the Arab Spring. All these questions and more, we will be asking them to General Allen. He has been very kind to give us from his time. We will have 1 hour. We will dedicate 40 minutes to discuss with him. I'll be asking him questions. Then we have 20 minutes where all the audience can put their questions and he will be answering them. You have the chat box and the Q&A box. You can type in your question and I'll be reading it to General Allen. General Allen, how are you again? We don't hear you.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to see you, Donnie. It's great to be with you today with the American University in Beirut. And let me start by saying how much the American people are with the Lebanese people and the people of Beirut in this moment of dire need. And we will do all that we can to be helpful because this is a moment of crisis for you. And if it is a crisis for the Lebanese people, it's a crisis for us as well. And we feel that very much. And so our prayers and our thoughts are with the Lebanese people and the people of Beirut constantly. And please take my best wishes for their continued success and my condolences on your losses. Please take that to the people, if you would.
Thank you very much, General. Thank you very much. We will want to start by asking you about your own experience in fighting extremism. I mean, as you can see, as anyone can see from your CV, you've been everywhere. You've been to Afghanistan, you've been to Iraq, you have been a key element in fighting ISIS and ISIL. You know, you've been this presidential envoy for the global coalition against ISIL. So you've seen it in different angles from different places. Tell us about your experience in fighting terrorism, going from the time of Iraq till today.
Well, I'll hit Iraq. I just want to give you just a couple of quick footnotes in that regard. My first experience with the issue of terrorism, but you very importantly made the case that often jihadi terrorism comes in the form of the movement and the employment of foreign fighters. And my first experience with that was when I led my Marines into Sarajevo to implement the Dayton Accords in '95, in the winter of '95 and early '96, where as we went about our business, we would ultimately discover that we were being stalked, followed, potentially targeted by foreign fighters that had come into that conflict. And in this case, the ones that were captured were Saudi foreign fighters. I'd later have additional experience in Mindanao in the Philippines with the Abu Sayyaf, and then later experience in Indonesia with Jemaah Islamiyah. That was before my experience in Iraq. And as I think we have discussed, I was the deputy commander in the Western Desert, if you will, Al-Anbar, where we fought hardcore Al-Qaeda fighters for the 13 months that I was there. And we fought, in particular, we fought the organization called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which was led, as you may remember, by a fellow by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. When he was killed in 2006, ultimately one of his lieutenants would take over, a fellow by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would later term himself Khalif Ibrahim, leading the Islamic State. From Iraq, I would ultimately go to Afghanistan, where I commanded for almost 19 months, and would deal with the Taliban, and would deal again with Al-Qaeda that was operating back and forth along with the Tariq-e-Taliban Pakistan, back and forth across the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then I retired, thought I was going home to Virginia to live a life of being a teacher or something, when I was asked to come back into the government to help John Kerry on Middle East peace, but then found myself pretty quickly repurposed by President Obama to help to organize the global coalition, of which Lebanon was an important part, against the emergence of the Islamic State. So sadly, my experience in this area goes all the way back to the mid-90s, a personal experience dealing with jihadists, foreign fighters, and terrorism. And while each location is different and each conflict is different, there are certain similarities that that help us as we think about these problems. I'll stop there. You're muted, I think.
Yes. General, you spoke about similarities. What are these similarities you find? I wanted actually to ask you about it. What are these similarities, going from Abu Sayyaf, going to the Taliban, going to the Jemaah Islamiyah? What key factor, trait or that you find that are common? Is there anything common, or each one is terrored for a different reason?
Well, each is complex. Each has its own local motivations. Frequently, it's a function of the local political environment, the local economic opportunities that the individuals there may enjoy. It would often be a function of religious tolerance or intolerance. But those conditions were frequently mobilized, if you will, and operationalized by a common Salafi ideology. And as you're well familiar, the Salafi ideology stems from the origins of the Salaf, which is, of course, the rightly guided population in the earliest days of Islam, the days of the Rashidun and the rightly guided leaders and the caliphs, the first caliphs after Muhammad. And so that ideology, which carries as one of its central tenets a return to a community of the faithful, that ideology was common, whether it was in the jungles of Mindanao or in Sumatra or in the desert in Al-Anbar or in the high ground in Kunar in Afghanistan. And so there was an ideology that tended to create a basis for commonality, but the reasons for the insurrections and the reasons for the dissatisfaction was often a function of corruption in the central government, a lack of opportunity for the youth, a disenfranchisement of large segments of the population. So there were local conditions which permitted an ideology to ultimately radicalize segments of the population and then convert that radicalized element into extremists, and then from extremists ultimately into terrorists or foreign fighters. And that was the commonality that I typically saw. Local conditions which were fertile for the acceptance of an ideology which would radicalize a youthful population with no hopes and no prospects, and then create a basis ultimately for the emergence of extremists and then terrorists. You're muted again.
I'm muted again. Thank you. So you think it's the local conditions that allow for this ideology to prosper, to thrive? Yeah. So how do people are recruited into terrorism? How do they prey on these people, on these youth? How do the recruitment happen?
Sure. Well, let me make a couple of points. You know, the U.S. has had for a long time, and I think you may even ask me a question later, so if I get to it too early, you can tell me to stop. You know, you have heard the U.S. Espouse a doctrine of countering violent extremism. And when your doctrine, when your strategies began with countering violent extremism, you're actually quite late into the process. The issue ought to be not countering violent extremism. The issue ought to be an emphasis on countering the radicalization. That whole process that preys on a vulnerable youth, a youth that has been disenfranchised by a weak or corrupt government, a youth that sees no economic prospects, no opportunity for education, rampant discrimination because they come from a particular sect or a particular tribe. And so these baseline sources of dissatisfaction can in fact be preyed upon with the right kinds of communications networks and now social media and the internet, which gives those who would radicalize populations, gives them enormous reach and enormous scope and enormous effectiveness in communicating their message. And that susceptible element of the population, we find, can be radicalized far more quickly than before. The Arab Spring, I think, is a perfect example of the rapid radicalization which occurred in many respects because of the social media and flattening the media environment. And so the ideology appeals to those elements of a population that have no prospects. And that is where I think often we fail as Americans to see that the issue isn't when we have to deal with violent extremism. We have to do that. We have to do that to help to defend our allies and our friends. We have to do that to defend ourselves. But if we did more to try to prevent the conditions which create the fertile ground for radicalization, that really it ought to be where our earliest emphasis should be, not in counterterrorism, which we have to do, and not constantly rendering this a security issue. We're at our best when we can render this a development issue or a stabilization issue, where we can try to help those populations that are disenfranchised and those governments that are just too weak to be able to incorporate all the elements of the population. Because if you start the issue with the military solution, then you have basically ignored all of the reasons why you're fighting the terrorists to begin with, which is that these youth, these young women and men have been radicalized by virtue of the conditions, insufferable conditions, without prospects for generations in some cases. And it creates an entire subculture of radicalization, which converts very quickly into extremism, and then the fight is on. And it's too late when you're there. We've all got to be putting our emphasis and our resources on those basic human causal factors that create such great dissatisfaction that a Salafi ideology becomes then the single recourse that many people feel is available to them in their lives.
Thank you, General. You've mentioned two words. One of this, you mentioned three words that I want to ask you about. You meant this is not a security issue. You need to have a holistic, comprehensive approach. But you mentioned stabilization, and you mentioned basic human factors. Well, I want to ask you something. Stabilization. Sometimes to stabilize, you are ready to accept regimes that are more or less authoritative or oppressive. And this is in contradiction with the basic human factor, which is representation. So how do you balance that? How do you have stability and at the same time allow people to express themselves, to be included, to be, to live with dignity? How do we make this balance?
Well, I would say, well, that's a very important question. It's really at the heart of how we should think about moving forward in these difficult environments. Stabilization isn't an end state. Stabilization, in my mind, is a process that creates the environment ultimately where you can move to an environment of governance that is representative, an environment of governance that enfranchises the people rather than disenfranchises the people. And frankly, that's hard for many people, particularly in the Middle East and in North Africa. It's hard for them to envisage that, because it's been a very long time in the case of many segments of the population there, where there in fact was a government that both had the capacity to reach out to enfranchise its population and to offer them the prospects that a government that is truly inclusive would want to. And of course, many of these governments, in fact, consciously seek to discriminate against or disenfranchise large segments of their population. And that is an issue. So I'm not proposing that stabilization is an end state. What I'm proposing is that you can't move from an environment that is defined largely by security measures and constant counterterrorism and warfare and police activity. I'm not proposing that we can move from there to a pluralistic society or a society that is oriented on human rights until we can actually stabilize the society. And I think a good example of that, and the United States failed here, frankly, was in northeast Syria. You know, the United States and our special operators supported the Syrian Democratic Forces, ultimately in defeating the Islamic State. And the reason that we were successful there was because we empowered local populations, Arabs, Turkmen, Kurds. We empowered the local population in an amalgamated army, ultimately to defeat the Islamic State. And about 2,000 Americans stayed behind to help the global coalition to counter the Islamic State create an environment on the ground that stabilized the environment, wasn't the end state, but stabilized the environment until we could be sure that the Islamic State had been eradicated and ultimately could progress beyond stabilization, ultimately to some form of a developing society and a developing economy. So you go from conflict to stabilization to developing, and ultimately you've got the kind of stability that you need. But, you asked the question about order versus chaos, and many people in the Middle East, many people in the world that suffer under these environments would simply tell you, I'm willing to accept anything that creates order in my life, but they're not willing to accept that as being the end state in their life. And this is, I said, the United States failed here. Those 2,000 American special operators, along with some of our allies from France and the United Kingdom and others, they were providing the stabilization environment within which then the quality of life of the people could be recovered after living under ISIL regimes, and local governance could begin to emerge in the villages and the towns along the Euphrates River. But that wasn't our intent. Our intent was not to stay there forever. Our intent was to create a platform of stabilization from which then governance could begin to unfold. But it requires economic opportunity. It requires assistance internationally. So it's a complex answer. You've asked a very important question. And stabilization, to me, has always been an intermediate step from a conflict environment to a developing environment, and then ultimately to a developed environment. So it is not an end state, it is a waypoint.
General, I want to... I'm muted. General, do you hear me now? General, what I want to say is also the foreign presence, like in northeast Syria, is necessary to create a balance between, as you said, the Kurds, the Arab, the Turkmens. Don't forget, these are people who lived under dictatorship. They will not, if you have removed dictatorship from a day to another, they will learn how to live together in peace. There are a lot of grievances.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And you'll remember that we woke up one morning after a phone call between our president and President Erdogan, and given literally hours, the United States forces were stampeded out of that area. We didn't want to stay there forever, but the U.S. and the coalition presence there was creating the platform where these grievances could be addressed, hopefully solved, but again, creating the stabilization platform where you can move then into the development that would be absolutely necessary to do two things. One is to give the people the life that they deserve. Northeast Syria had been very stable for many, many years. Now, yes, they lived under a dictator in Damascus, but it had been stable for many, many years. ISIL turned that completely on its head, and it did to the people of that region things that were just unthinkable, even by the standards of the Al-Qaeda terrorism that we had come to know in the aftermath of 2001. So the foreign forces had a role there, and the population largely accepted the presence of those foreign fighters, that foreign presence. But we were pulled out too early. The Turks began running full-blown military operations. The Russians were inserted, and let me just tell you, I think most of those people, if given the choice between having a Russian presence for their own version of stabilization as the handmaidens of the Turks, or Bashar al-Assad, or the presence of the Americans and the rest of the coalition, I think the choice would have been very clear. And look, for me, it was a very painful thing to see that one day we're there helping them to recover their lives, and the next day we're driving out as fast as we can and they're throwing rotten vegetables at us. That was a very difficult thing for us to see, because we believed that we were playing an important role, not a permanent role, but an important role for that moment, to try to bring order and stability so that governance could emerge and those grievances, which you properly pointed out, could ultimately be solved.
Thank you, General. There's an issue also. You said about the northeast of Syria that you pulled out after a phone call with President Erdogan and President Trump. But this is not the first time where you pull out prematurely. Look at Iraq. the surge was quite successful in stabilizing, in creating, the Sahawat, the awakening, which was the Sunni Shia dialogue, and it was coupled with a communication campaign. It was quite successful. And then suddenly you pulled out. And then you had the reemergence of violence.
Look, I was there at the birth of the Sahwa al-Anbar and the Sahwa al-Iraq, which was the legacy version, the subsequent version. And I worked very closely with the sheikhs, ultimately in creating an environment where the tribes, which I believed were the basic tectonic plates of the society of Iraq, where the tribes would ultimately begin to create an environment of working with civil government to find an equilibrium in the aftermath of Al-Qaeda and the aftermath of the Allied invasion and the war that we fought in Iraq. But we left too early. And I've been very clear on that. We left at the end of 2011. I was part of the command element of the central command that had planned it, and it was very clear to me that we left too early. And one of the consequences of having left Iraq too early was that it created a vacuum, an incomplete preparation of regions within Iraq, particularly the Sunni elements of the West, the key 4 Sunni provinces in the West. It left a vacuum of leadership there and an absence of connectivity between those provinces and the central government that was dominated by Shia leadership, in this case, Nouri al-Maliki. It left an absence of connectivity and an absence of continuity in those provinces. We didn't finish the job. And so we should not have been surprised that we saw then the successor element of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2013 begin to emerge in the West as it spilled over from the civil war in Syria, and it was called the Islamic State, Daesh. And that created then the sequence of events which caused us to have to go back in again in 2014.
Well, it's you hear me now?
Heard you before.
Yeah, it's not only in Iraq, also if we can go before, Afghanistan, you helped the Mujahideen then, there was a big vacuum left and you had the Taliban. So there is this criticism that is always a criticism of American policy that you never finish the job done. As soon as you see any result, you just pull out. And then you have emergence of violence and emergence of extremism. So there is this, and I want to ask you about what you said. There was lack of connectivity, and there was a central government that's Shia, where the West was Sunni. Where do you think sectarianism plays in today's terrorism? Because the first wave of terrorism, the Salafi jihadi of bin Laden, they were not sectarian, they were not anti-Shia, they were anti-West and anti the hegemony of the West. So how do you see the face of terrorism changing, and where does sectarianism play into that?
Well, sectarianism, I think, has always been present in many of these struggles. My own ancestors, Protestants in Northern Ireland, fled that region because of sectarian problems between the Protestants and the Catholics. And I had a really interesting experience when I was in Al-Anbar, and I was very close to the tribes, most of whom were Sunni tribes. But I had this wonderful experience on one occasion where tribal leaders from the south joined the tribal leaders from Al-Anbar. And for this moment, I was exposed to the reality that for many of the people in the region, being Sunni or Shia was less important than the bloodlines and the unity of the tribes. And what had became clear to me as I watched this unfold was that sectarianism is a very powerful dividing force. It's a very powerful force. And when you are successful, as in political terms, in weaponizing those differences, the difference between Catholic and Protestant, the difference between Muslim and Serb and Croatian, the difference between Shia and Sunni. When you're able to weaponize those differences, then sectarianism becomes a principal tool for division. And it becomes the basis and the platform for radicalization. And it becomes then the basis ultimately for extremism and terrorism. And so one of the important aspects of the strategies that we should try to all embrace in dealing with terrorism is analyzing the sources of the sectarianism and see if there are broad strategies associated at the social level, at the tribal level, at the grassroots level within society of bringing them back together again. When I was in Bosnia, and I would drive through these villages that had been fighting now in that civil war for some period of time, you would see entire villages with homes that had been in those valleys for hundreds of years. And as you drove through the village, you'd see one home and then another home and then a third home in a village with several hundred homes that were nothing but burned out hulks. And that was where the Muslims, the Bosniaks, had lived in that village. But they had lived in that village at complete and utter peace with their Christian neighbors for hundreds of years. But suddenly the sectarianism, which was weaponized in that conflict, weaponized in Iraq, weaponized in Afghanistan, weaponized in almost all of these conflicts, particularly by the Islamic State, that was an extraordinarily powerful, divisive force that created ultimately the platform for extremism and then terrorism. So any strategy to deal with this has got to be a strategy that examines the sources of sectarianism and seeks at a grassroots level to try to resolve those sectarian differences, so that the natural forces that I saw on the ground in Al-Anbar between the ancient tribes, where, for example, one of my principal allies in Al-Anbar, his tribe was split almost half Sunni and Shia. And he was married to a Shia woman from his tribe in the south. They made no distinctions between the two. The distinctions often were between the tribes, or between the tribes and the central government or the civil government. But for me, I learned an important lesson on the ground in Bosnia and then again in Al-Anbar, and that is sectarianism is a difference that can be weaponized by politicians to create or to facilitate their objectives to create conflict. And so if we're going to try to solve the problem and be constructive in the problem, we've got to see why those sources of sectarianism have created those divisions, which will cause people to blow themselves up and to kill each other in those large numbers. I'm not being naive that it's easy to solve. What I'm saying is that strategies to counter radicalization and strategies to counter extremism have to have, as an important component of the strategy, an analysis and an understanding of how sectarianism, either in Northern Ireland or in the jungles of Mindanao or in the western desert of Al-Anbar or in the mountains of Afghanistan, how did sectarianism take root and become the divisive force that caused one element of the population to fall upon and to kill another element?
Thank you, Gerald. Do you hear me? Yeah. Gerald, you said sources of sectarianism, and this is not my view, but many people criticize the US, and they think the US, whether intentionally or unintentionally, instigating sectarianism by introducing a constitution that divided people as Shia and Sunni of Kurds instead of at looking at them as Iraqi. So the rationale is when the law treats you as Sunni before it treats you as an Iraqi. You think of yourself as a Sunni before you think of yourself as an Iraqi. And the constitution was brought up under American guardianship. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think to some extent, and I agree with your point, to some extent, the Constitution ultimately had to create a basis of power sharing in the country. One of the problems that we had in Iraq, and it's a problem that we have faced in many places, is in an effort to resolve conflict, there had to be a moment when those elements, those participants to the conflict, could be relatively assured that in resolving the conflict, that first and foremost, their interests would be met, that their populations would be safe, and that the process of political power sharing could be in some form or another equitable. And I would propose, having watched the aftermath of the conflict in Indonesia, especially in East Timor, watching the Filipinos try to deal with the Muslim South in Mindanao, and in other places, you just can't bring conflict to a conclusion without assuring the parties to that conflict that they've got a future politically, that they have a future economically, and that their segment of the population will be secure and free from whatever the continued strife and death or disenfranchisement will bring. Now, what I would propose is that the Constitution was a start. It didn't have to be a finish. And as Iraq's political future evolved, and of course it's still in very difficult circumstances, the Constitution had to acknowledge that the three principal segments of Iraq was, as you properly pointed out, the Shia element largely in the south, the Sunni element largely in the west, and ultimately the Kurdish element in the north. And I would propose that it would have been virtually impossible to form a government in the aftermath of that war without ensuring that there was political equity of some form or another in the organization of the government. Now, from the U.S. perspective, if the Constitution ultimately were modified by those elements that were participants to the conflict and ultimately participants to the peace, and it was a modification of the Constitution that was ratified by all segments of the population, they could take that Constitution and move on. So it wasn't a perfect document by any stretch of the imagination. And your question seems to imply that by using this Constitution, we froze those differences in place and created, in essence, perpetual conflict. I would put it a different way. And it created an initial means by which there was a political relationship between those groups, with the idea that later, once this political relationship became institutionalized, they could amend the Constitution when those differences didn't matter. But this at least got everybody to the table initially. Wasn't a perfect Constitution by any stretch of the imagination. But I participated in governmental activities in Baghdad. I participated in governmental activities in Erbil, and I participated in government activities in Al-Ramadi, where all three segments of the government came together. It was unthinkable. Even years before, it was certainly unthinkable under Saddam. And here in the aftermath of the American war, if you will, I'll just use that term to give us context, bringing all three of those parties in the room and having the capacity to talk about a political future and the sharing of power, and ultimately moving from conflict to development and from development to joining the community of nations, that was just unthinkable. The Constitution gave us the capacity to begin that conversation, though I never believed that the Constitution was the end state. I believe the Constitution, as we saw it, was a start. And it was not perfect. It was imperfect in many ways, but it was a start. And we needed to see, and it just didn't exist because we pulled out too early, we needed to see the stabilization over time of these political relationships, which would create trust between the three principal segments of the population and ultimately permit them to move beyond the original Constitution.
Jen, you mentioned the word trust. You mentioned the word trust, which is very important, because as we were talking, you said first we have to see what are the reasons that are driving extremism, and we have to fight them. Now you're saying, hey, though the division might have emphasized, the different sects, but we had to do it just to give security for each group or each tribe. that they will not be, annihilated by the others. Don't forget, these are regimes that have been under dictatorship where no one has the right to say anything. Can we create trust? Because is trust a way to overcome sectarianism and later on like terrorism first?
Well, I
Because
think so.
as you said, the reason why people are so desperate that they're ready to blow up themselves is that the political condition, they don't trust the government, they don't trust, they don't trust the security forces. So that's what they do. So do you think trust, and how can we trust build? How can we build trust?
Well, each conflict is different. I'll go back to the jungles of Mindanao. When I was involved in that particular conflict with the Abu Sayyaf, one of the challenges that we had was with the Moro National Liberation Front, which was the original Muslim separatist organization, which through a long process of enfranchisement of the leadership and the willingness of the central government in Manila to trust that they would become part of the solution rather than a major part of the problem. Eventually, the MNLF became literally part of the solution. But the war between the central government and the MNLF went on for years and years. Now, the problem, as they began to ultimately trust themselves, what we discovered was that a segment of that population, a segment of that group, broke away and became the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and they became the new segment, unwilling ultimately to embrace trust, unwilling ultimately to take the chance. And what trust does in this context is everyone is going to have to take a chance. And the trust comes from, if I surrender some aspect of my security or I surrender some aspect of my political prerogatives, I trust that you will not take advantage of that to the detriment of my political future, but more importantly, to the security of my population. And so this is often where the role of the United States or the international community can come in. And that is to create the conditions where the parties to the conflict can feel sufficiently confident in the mediating elements, which is the international community. It might be France, it might be the United States, it might be multiple states, where they are willing to take the risk of appearing to trust their opponents to create an environment whereby a political future can be found, a political accommodation can be found. But your question is very important. You can't solve these conflicts if you can't provide a common vision of where this can go. And again, I'm not so naive as to believe this is easy. This is really hard. It's really hard in the Middle East. It's really hard in Southeast Asia. And it's really hard in the jungles of northern South America and in Central America, where these groups have become so polarized and separate from each other. Sometimes it's about sectarianism, sometimes it's about class, sometimes it's about economics, sometimes it's about politics, that they're never willing to trust. They're never willing to take a chance and place some aspect of their future or their security in the hands of their opponents. This is where the international community can play an important role. To your point about the Constitution, it did freeze in the differences in Iraq. It did freeze in the differences between Shia in the south, the majority, Sunnis in the west, and the Kurds in the north. It did freeze that. But it created a willingness of those groups to accept that relationship until such time as there was sufficient political trust and economic development and social interaction that Constitution could be amended. But you can't go forward. Look, I was part of the peace process on the ground on the West Bank between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And if I heard it once, I heard it 100 times from both sides. There is a complete absence of trust. You guys are you Americans are wasting your time. We will never trust each other. Now, I don't want to get into that conversation today. That's the next time I come on your program. But what I learned from there was there is no chance to progress from a conflict-ridden society to a developing society if the mediating elements, whether it's indigenous mediating elements or international mediating elements, if they can't create a platform where trust can be evolved.
So now you said mediating, you mentioned something called mediating element. So you think, for example, in cases like we have terrorism, and we're now talking in the Middle East, let's say in Iraq and in Syria, do you need mediation? Do you need international force? Because a lot of people say terrorism, you know, there is an idea, for right or for wrong, that terrorism is instigated by outsiders.
Well, I think we're talking about several different things here. If you're talking about the large on-the-ground presence of foreign troops, that is often one of the principal sources of terrorism. I couldn't agree with you more. And we learned that, of course, in Iraq, and we learned that in Afghanistan, and we've learned that in other places. And that was why when we began the process of dealing with the Islamic State, there was quite a debate in the United States about whether we should deploy conventional American forces to try to roll these guys up very quickly with decisive military operations, or should we try to empower the Iraqis and the indigenous forces along the Euphrates River in Syria? I mean, that was really the debate. And those of us who lived through I was in Al-Anbar in 2006, 7, and 8. It was the worst violence in the worst year of that war. And what I learned was if you can't empower the local government, the local mayors and the tribes to deal with this themselves, no amount of foreign military presence will ever solve this. That's why when we sought to create the global coalition to counter the Islamic State, our principal objective wasn't to have an international force inserted back into Iraq to fight the Islamic State. Our intention was to insert sufficient amounts of forces on the ground to empower the Iraqis or the Syrian Democratic Forces for them to be what we call the defeat mechanism. Because that large foreign presence on the ground is in fact a polarizing force, is in fact the basis whereby terrorists can make the claim that they are the liberating force, that they are in fact operating on behalf of the local population. And so I've given you some thoughts on my views on strategy. When we consider in the context of terrorism or terrorist events or terrorist conflicts, terrorist characterized conflicts, the solution may have to be, because of the nature of the emergency, that foreign forces will be involved. But the very best way to do it is to give capacity for the local and indigenous forces to provide the security that's necessary ultimately for the population. Let me make an important point too. What I have discovered now in 5 different conflicts I've been involved in is as the terrorist element is ultimately diminished or defeated, one of the things that you find very quickly is that there are lawless criminal elements that follow or emerge in the aftermath of the defeat of the terrorist formations themselves. And so this is not just about strengthening the army. It's about strengthening the security mechanism and ensuring that that security mechanism is in fact connected to the central government. Because if you come in and you just make the security mechanism strong and capable and you haven't connected it politically to the central government and to the people, then you've got a security element that may in fact become even worse than the terrorists over time.
Thank you, General. General, I want to ask you, how do you see the prospect? You know, how do you see now, given the political landscape in the region, what you see in Syria, what you see in Iraq, the situation in Lebanon is extremely unstable. You have now proxy war everywhere in the region. How do you see, as you said, it is political actors who have weaponized sectarianism, weaponize, and not particularly sectarianism, weaponize differences. And and this is how we get terrorism. How do you see the prospect of violent extremism or terrorism in the region?
Well, I think it's several problems here. One is that the incipient corruption that we have seen in many of the governments in the region make it almost impossible ultimately to create the conditions whereby large segments of the populations are not going to be radicalized, or aren't going to support radical organizations or terrorists as an alternative to the kinds of conduct and behavior that central governments typically evidence with respect to their populations. So corruption is a major problem in the region. I also believe that where the United States had been a factor in seeking to create an environment whereby mediation could occur, under this administration, we've largely gotten out of that business almost entirely. And the other thing that we've gotten out of the business of is using development as one of the principal means to solve these problems, not military force, but development. This is something that we've done a lot about at Brookings. From my perspective, I spent 42 years in uniform. From my perspective, the solution to terrorism has to begin with an understanding of how the population has suffered and how ultimately sectarianism can be dismantled and how ultimately social cohesion can be created. None of that, in the end, comes from the end of a weapon. Most of that comes from an understanding of the cultural differences that can ultimately be resolved with the right kinds of development, with the right kinds of prospects, with the right kinds of political development that we can help. We can't do it, but we can help. And as I said before, the terrorist problems are different in many places. In Lebanon, of course, there's a Shia element to it, Hezbollah, and the association with Iran, and the incipient Syrian influence that has been in Lebanon for some period of time. In Syria, it's a crisis that resulted ultimately from Bashar al-Assad in 2011, rather than to deal with the earliest popular uprisings, which was about the social conditions. Rather than to deal with it at a political and social level, he chose to make war upon his people, and that created the civil war that we see now, where multiple factors are involved. Proxies out of the Gulf, proxies out of Europe, proxies out of Turkey, proxies out of North Africa. That's a very different situation, and that's going to be difficult to solve as well. And then you have the Middle East itself, where you have Iraq and you have Iran. That's largely a Sunni coalition led by the Saudis and others, dealing with a long-term Cold War environment with the Shia of Iran, led by the revolutionary government in Tehran. So each one is different. Each one has a set of unique circumstances that must be understood. One of the problems in the West is that we have failed to understand at the grassroots level the human conditions that have been violated for so long that people have no option except strap on a suicide vest. And when you come in from the top and you try to solve this as a security problem, rather than to try to see where the problem is at the bottom and the human causal factors that have to be resolved, if you don't start there, or if that's not a principal part of your ultimate strategy, then you are going after the wrong solution. You're solving a military problem, and this is not a military problem. It's a human problem. It's a social problem. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem. And the military hammer can't be the solution here. And this is where the United States has failed in its leadership. And I would hope that perhaps a future administration would seek to be more constructive and more helpful in the region. But it's also where I think the West has largely failed as well. It hasn't enabled those kinds of forces that could be at work to improve the social condition, as opposed to dealing with it as strictly as a terrorist problem.
General, the question came all at once. I think this is because the question came all at once. I have a question from Ms. Rita. What would the new generation of ISIS emerge, given the lack of sustainable solution and what looks most likely failing states in the region? Do you see a new generation of ISIS emerging?
Well, I think there's a real possibility of that. One of the problems that one of the problems that you have is when you deal with ISIS solely as a terrorist organization, you miss the reasons why populations would have accepted them to begin with. When I led the global coalition against the Islamic State, one of the things that was very clear to me when I went back in to talk to the sheikhs of Al-Anbar, one of the reasons that the tribes along the Euphrates and Al-Anbar were willing to accept the Islamic State in 2013 was because their prospects with the Shia-led government in Baghdad were about zero. And so if we, this goes back to what I've said many times, if we don't try to get after the underlying social conditions, organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and the Taliban and the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and Abu Sayyaf, they will always find purchase in the dissatisfaction of populations that have been oppressed and have been disenfranchised. And if that's not where your solution begins, and rather than it begins as a military problem, you never solve the problem. And you can convince yourself that you have by killing enough terrorists. And the one thing I learned very early in my life in this process was you cannot kill your way out of these crises. You have ultimately got to solve the base human factors that create radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. And I have to say, sadly, I've got about 3 minutes left because I've got something else that's going to happen.
Yeah, I know. So I have one quick question. Then if you have any last word to say, the question, there have many other questions, but I'm going to take only one. What do you think about the implementation of social rehabilitation of ex-terrorists? Does it work? And deported and returned to Indonesia from your perspective. So what do you think about rehabilitation and your last word?
Yeah, each is different. One of the things that, one of the more difficult problems that we had with the Islamic State was dealing with it in the information environment. We had a pretty good handle on the military piece, and we had a pretty good handle on the economic piece. We had a pretty good handle on limiting the movement of foreign fighters, but we really had a hard time competing within the information environment. And we found that there were two very powerful forces which could deal with this in the context of the potential, and we didn't really talk about this, we probably could have, the potential for recruitment. And the two powerful forces were bringing families of those fighters that had gone off into this cause and gotten themselves killed. The mother who's weeping on a camera and talking about how she wishes her son were still with her. What is she going to do now? The men of her family have all been killed because they went off to fight in this jihad. That was an extraordinarily powerful force. But the other powerful force were those elements, those jihadis, those foreign fighters, terrorists, who had ultimately been reconciled, that had gone into some form of a program and were able to explain in detail, not because they had a gun to their head, but because they had truly seen that their earlier view had gotten them into this problem and that their current view was very different. That was a very, very powerful tool. And I traveled the world when I was the special envoy to the Islamic State. And many countries that would ultimately have to absorb back their returning foreign fighters, many countries had reconciliation and remediation programs, if you will. And all of them were different. And many of them most of them were based upon unique societal factors from that particular country. So not all of them were successful. Some of them were very successful. But part of the strategy in dealing with an organization like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, part of the strategy has got to be the reconciliation of those fighters that are returned either as prisoners or those fighters that returned because they found that the conditions on the ground really weren't an Islamic utopia. It, in fact, was a Muslim hell. And the reality of the world they lived in was so awful that they came back and they were just hoping to be reconciled into their societies. And those countries that had reconciliation programs that truly embraced them and truly tried to help them to find their way back into society were the ones that had the fewest numbers of what we call recidivists, those who would ultimately re-embrace the radical and extremist ideology. So each was different. Some were very successful. One of the jobs I had was to try to point out those areas of success to other countries so that they could embrace perhaps similar factors. And finally, it's been an honor to be with you today. It's great to see you again. I want to thank you for your personal role in the scholarship that you constantly are presenting us, in the work that you're doing, the writings that you are able to publish. Thank you for your personal role in all of this. And I'll end where I started, which is that for the people of Lebanon, please know that you are in our thoughts and our prayers among the American people constantly. And we hope that we can help you ultimately to go past this difficult moment in your country right now and to emerge stronger than ever. God bless you all.
Thank you, General. Thank you very much. It was a very insightful session. And thank you all for watching us. And sorry we couldn't take all the questions. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone. And good morning to you. Good day, General. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye.